Hey guys, tonight's absolutely thrilling episode is about one of history's most notoriously misunderstood groups, the Knights Templar. Yes, those white coat-wearing medieval bodyguards of Christendom, often portrayed as chivalrous warriors on some holy mission. But what if I told you that beneath those crosses and shining armor lay a mashup of the bizarre, the brutal, and the downright forbidden? Welcome to 7 Forbidden Rituals of the Knights Templar and more. Dark Secrets Uncovered. Now, forget everything you thought you knew about these guys. This isn't your typical history lesson peppered with heroic tales and heroic knights galloping into battle for religion and justice. No. Tonight, we're peeling back the polished legend to expose a world of shadowy rites, dark arts, and downright scandalous initiation. Rituals that make medieval drama look like a mild afternoon tea party. The central scandal we're sinking our teeth into is how the Templars engaged in clandestine ceremonies, rituals, mixing dark occult practices, savage violence, and secretive behaviors so wild they'd give modern conspiracy theorists a run for their money. Our thesis tonight: these rituals were not only a means of initiation, but a cryptic gateway into a brotherhood that thrived on a mix of brutal rites and pseudo-scientific beliefs, blurring the line between fanatic order and something far more disturbing. So, buckle up, because our first stop into this forbidden labyrinth is the secrets of forbidden initiations, the violent and bizarre rites that no guidebook shows you. Initiation in the Knights Templar wasn't just swear the oath, here's your sword. It was a sordid, often brutal baptism by fire designed to break you down physically, mentally, and spiritually. It's 1129 AD, in a dilapidated chapel somewhere near the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. New recruits are blindfolded, gagged, and dragged in chains through candlelit corridors. Now, this isn't some medieval spa day. Scholars and sarcastic historians alike agree. The initiation ceremonies were marked by acts of physical punishment, humiliating tests, and violent prostrations meant to symbolize the death of the old self and rebirth as a Templar warrior. Sounds lovely, right? What could possibly go wrong? The evidence here isn't just dusty manuscripts or exaggerated tales. There are documents from the infamous 1307 trials, the inquisitive probes from King Philip IV of France, detailing testimonies of severe beatings, branding with hot irons, and ritual whippings during initiation. Imagine the medieval equivalent of hazing, but with religious fanaticism and total obedience thrown into the mix. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a witness at the trials describing how a candidate was forced to kneel on sharp stones while being struck across the shoulders with wooden rods called the discipline. This was not some health-conscious perseverance test. Instead, it was designed to prove unyielding submission to the order, erasing any thoughts of personal will. If that doesn't set the tone, let's add a spicy detail. Initiates were sometimes compelled to spit on the cross, deny Christ in symbolic acts of ritual blasphemy to test their loyalty to the brotherhood over church. Charming, huh? This little blasphemous twist taught them the ultimate paradox of being a holy warrior willing to reject sacred tenets when the order demanded. Doublethink before George Orwell made it famous. And while this sounds extreme, it actually makes a twisted kind of sense. The Templars had to operate secretly, pledge unwavering loyalty, and survive in the brutal political-religious climate of the Crusades. So rigorous, psychologically torturous initiation ceremonies were their brilliant decision-making tool to build bond and discipline. But wait, there's more disturbing evidence floating in the historical ether. Some testimonies describe candidates being made to swallow black pills or powders during initiation, a ritual believed to grant protection in battle or spiritual enlightenment. What exactly these powders contained? Theories range from simple herbs to concoctions laced with mind-altering substances. Sounds like medieval pharmaceutical experimentation crossed with alchemy, with a dash of what could possibly go wrong. And ritual scars weren't just punitive measures but souvenirs of membership, brands of loyalty pressed into flesh. These marks set Templars apart not just spiritually but physically, a permanent badge of brotherhood and possibly a form of identification in covert missions. Later, some members reportedly hid these brands under their cloaks, a secret code of identity known only within their circle. Talk about exclusive club perks. To understand this, you have to put it in the context of the times. A violent world torn apart by holy wars, rampant betrayal, and a medieval justice system that was anything but just. The Templar initiation rites were crafted for survival as much as for reverence, weaving paranoia, mysticism, and these savage tests into a tapestry of fear and obedience. Think of it as the original secret society with torture porn elements, perfectly designed to scare recruits into compliance and loyalty. What's more, these rituals often took place at night, in crypt-like chambers beneath their Paris headquarters, famously known as the Temple in France. The chilling atmosphere of flickering candles, Gothic arches, and whispered chants played right into the psychological manipulation of candidates. Some historians argue these ceremonies included symbolic deaths, where recruits were wrapped in burial shrouds and resurrected as knights, further blurring the line between piety and morbid spectacle. And the violent initiation wasn't the end. The members were subjected to ongoing physical trials to maintain status. Failing these tests could mean expulsion, shame, or worse, unthinkable punishments according to the secret rules governing the order. Of course, the official line from the Templars was pious obedience and defense of the Holy Land. But as King Philip IV's interrogations exposed in 1307, the inner workings of these rituals were anything but innocent. The very secrecy that formed their strength also fanned rumors of devil worship, heresy, and bloodthirsty oaths. Were these rumors exaggerations fueled by rival powers or thin veils over some darker truth? Scars, brutal beatings, symbolic blasphemy, secret powders, ritual deaths. This wasn't just knightly discipline. It was a world designed to break down individuality and create unbreakable loyalty. The Knights Templar initiation was less about glowing heroism and more like surviving a medieval horror show masked as a holy rite. Now, as we peel back these layers, we get a glimpse of an order that was part cult, part elite military force, and all the more dangerous for its ironclad secrecy. And if these violent initiations shocked you, wait until you discover the whispered secrets of what went on once the armor came off. Because if breaking bones and brands made you a Templar, what kind of secrets did these brothers keep behind closed doors? Speaking of which, it's time to dive into the darker, more euphemistic accounts of hidden liaisons, the covert behaviors, and the scandals the medieval chroniclers tiptoed around in hushed tones. The whispers of hidden liaisons. Because when it comes to forbidden history, violence is just the overture. The real symphony lies in what the Templars did when they thought no one was watching. Now that we've peeled back the layers on the brutal initiation rites and violent ceremonies that prospective knights faced, we can begin to grasp the full scope of how deeply twisted the personal lives within the order truly were. The handful of neophytes who survived those blood-soaked trials entered more than just a brotherhood. They stepped into a discreet world where whispered liaisons and hidden scandals punctuated the code of honor. Yes, beneath that emblematic white mantle, stained with red crosses, the Knights Templar indulged in a less publicly palatable kind of forbidden behavior, exposing a tangled web of euphemistic affairs, secret relationships, and outrageous betrayals. We just glimpsed how violence wasn't solely reserved for battlefield. Valor or brutal initiations but also manifested in the ways punishments for supposed indiscretions were meted out inside the orders, cloisters, and commanderies. If the rigorous recruitment sounded rough, wait till you hear about what happened behind closed doors when those indiscretions came into light, or were merely suspected. The rigid facade of brotherhood cracked under the weight of scandalous whispers about the nature of those relationships, and what happened when the Templar code was flagrantly broken. It all paints a picture far grimmer than the chivalrous legends would have you believe. The transformation from hopeful recruit to calibrated warrior wasn't the only metamorphosis expected by the Order's hierarchy. Among the lesser-discussed secrets lie the euphemistic accounts woven into the testimonies collected during the infamous trials of the early 14th century. Accounts from the 1307 persecution indicted the order on charges that sound more like the plot of a medieval soap opera than the biography of revered crusaders. Witness depositions testified to intimate dealings between brothers, often described with carefully chosen language. Touching against custom, the exchange of forbidden favors, or breaching the sacred veil of purity, despite the order's solemn vow of chastity. Here, euphemism meets scandal head-on, as chroniclers like Gilles de Muissy and the damning transcripts from the Parisian inquisitors present a picture full of clandestine rendezvous and covert encounters. It's critical to contextualize this within the era's socio-religious framework. The vow of chastity wasn't just a guideline. It was a foundational pillar of Templar identity, supposed to elevate them spiritually above earthly desires. But what happens when those policies clash with human nature and the pressures of enforced brotherhoods, cramped living quarters, and decades spent on crusade? The answer: tensions bubbling under the surface that exploded into plenty of whispered rumors and outright allegations of scandal, ranging from mutual comforting to outright allegations of sodomy, a word that appears repeatedly in the records, right alongside horrific confessions obtained, shall we say, under rather painful questioning. To draw a modern analogy, it's a scandal that would make today's political sex scandals look like innocent flirtations in comparison. Yet, even more disturbing than just the presence of these liaisons was the violent discipline that followed discovery or suspicion. Chroniclers of the time, including the ever-entertaining chronicler Jean de Joinville, detailed punishments like public beatings, locking offenders in dark cells, often with no sustenance beyond stale bread and runoff water, or even torture in the shadowed dungeons beneath the Order's strongest fortresses. Remember, these were men simultaneously celebrated as paragons of Christian chastity and subject to medieval standards of disciplinary brutality that make modern judicial systems seem shockingly lenient. Talk about keeping your secrets under lock and key. Quite literally, what could possibly go wrong? Looking deeper into the infamous Chinon parchment of 1308, uncovered centuries later, we find the Pope's unexpected involvement regarding these accusations. Pope Clement V, not exactly the most incorruptible of religious heads, seemed to walk a tightrope between outright suppression and strategic leniency. He urged investigations into the alleged acts against the Order's statutes, a diplomatic way of hinting at these sordid affairs without naming names publicly. The parchment suggests the accusations were widespread enough to cause alarm, but also politically convenient to use as a lever for the Crown's growing disdain for the Templars' increasing wealth and autonomy. Makes you wonder, were the salacious stories a convenient cover for political gaslighting? Probably. But the very fact they gained traction indicates just how common, or at least how feared, these behaviors were perceived to be. The chronicler Geoffrey of Paris offers one particularly juicy episode from the Templars' own inner circles. A novice suspected of breaking the sacred silence with an elder brother was alleged to have performed what the record delicately terms as engaging in unchaste union, an affectionate phrase that barely disguises the severity of the accusation. The response: not another round of prayer or reflection, but a savage whipping administered in the dim light of the chapter hall, witnessed by the entire order assembled. According to those same records, the offender was further sentenced to remain barefoot in the snow outside the commandery for 3 days, presumably to reconsider the virtues of chastity, or at least to contemplate the probability of frostbite as an alternative. Charming stuff, and yet this disciplinary spectacle served as a warning to other brothers. Crossover of the forbidden kind would be met with both physical suffering and public shaming. The Templars' way of saying, keep it in your armor or pay the price. But the liaisons didn't always remain secret or tolerated by an iron fist. For some, punishment meant a trip to the infamous Black Cell inside the fortress of La Cité de Carcassonne, operated under Templar control. Surrounded by legends of spectral hauntings and whispered despair, The black cell was a chamber so grim that historians speculated functioned both as solitary confinement and a torture chamber. Those accused of enticements beyond brotherly love were rumored to be chained here, with food and water rationed to encourage repentance or confession. Suetonius would have been proud of such brutal methods had he chronicled medieval prison conditions, and historians occasionally compare these punishments to the brutal interrogations of Roman times. The echoes of chained cries and prayers seem almost to transcend centuries, reminding us these warrior monks' friendships weren't always forged in trust or piety, but sometimes in suspicion, fear, and brutal control. If you're starting to think the Templars' behavior was akin to a medieval rom-com gone wrong, you're not far off, except the darkness runs far deeper than unrequited affection or jealous quarrels. There are reports of systematic coercion and intimidation to maintain order within the ranks. The Templar hierarchy apparently implemented remedies for any signs of deviant behavior that went well beyond mere chastisement, occasionally requiring elder knights to supervise younger brothers' private quarters, ostensibly to ensure adherence to vows, but, irony of ironies, also facilitating further abuses of power. You see, the same mechanisms intended to prevent misconduct instead created an environment ripe for exploitation, further blurring the line between victim and perpetrator. The more you dig, the less it looks like a straightforward military order and more like a psychological labyrinth of repression, secrecy, and fear. Some particular cases stand out, such as that of Brother Guillaume de Nogaret, a notorious Templar who was accused during the trials not only of breaking his vows but of manipulating several younger brothers into undignified favors, a polite way to say he presumed to exploit his status. The testimonies describe the psychological torment endured by novices caught in such predicaments, locked away, threatened with violence, or worse, branded with secret signs meant to mark their sins. It's a grim precursor to modern discussions about power dynamics within closed communities, making you realize how little has changed in over 7 centuries. Not exactly the brotherhood they like to preach about. The economic and social implications of these secretive and scandalous behaviors add another dimension to the Templars' troubled history. These knights weren't just penitent warriors. They also operated as one of the most powerful financial institutions of medieval Europe, running vast networks of banking, loans, and estates. The mixture of secret liaisons and violent enforcement mechanisms created a toxic environment of manipulation and blackmail that, some scholars argue, helped erode the order's integrity. If you think about it, using intimate secrets as currency is an ancient game. The Knights Templar might have been pioneers in wielding scandal as a tool for covert control. Think of it as medieval corporate espionage, except with iron fists, whips, and cloaks instead of suits. And while the church and secular authorities initially tolerated or even admired the order's military prowess and economic acumen, mounting rumors of these clandestine behaviors became impossible to ignore. The scandalous accusations, compounded by violent initiations and secret punishments, painted an image that made the order vulnerable to accusations of heresy and corruption, giving King Philip IV of France the perfect excuse to seize their assets in 1307. His bold move, arguably one of the most ruthless land grabs in medieval history, relied heavily on the public's appetite for scandal, an appetite carefully whetted by those disturbing testimonies detailing secret rites and forbidden liaisons. Psychologically, this dark undercurrent within the Templar ranks suggests a fraught dynamic of repression and projection. The enforced chastity and brotherhood created a pressure cooker where natural human desires were twisted into sources of guilt and shame, fueling both covert relationships and monstrous punishments. This paradox is nothing new for closed groups bound by strict codes, but the medieval context amplified its consequences into life-threatening humiliation and physical torment, wielded ruthlessly by the order's commanders to maintain the illusion of purity. A state of organized hypocrisy, if ever there was one. Interestingly, cultural depictions from the late Middle Ages onwards have largely sanitized or completely omitted these sordid details, preferring the romanticized image of the Templar knight. This intentional whitewashing is akin to modern political spin doctoring, keeping the dirty laundry locked away while promoting a glossy brand to the masses. Yet, the evidence, buried in trial transcripts, inquisitorial notes, and contemporary chronicles, refuses to be ignored. It reveals not a band of chivalrous saints, but a secret society grappling with its own demons, using euphemism and violence to keep scandal at bay. What could possibly go wrong? And if you thought the physical punishments and covert liaisons constituted the darkest chapters, brace yourself. Hidden within the Order's ritual symbolism lay mysteries more bizarre and unsettling than even these scandalous behaviors. Now that we've explored how the Knights Templar managed their forbidden personal relationships behind a veil of euphemism and brutality, the rituals of the Order, or what remained unspoken, hint at a world filled with enigmatic symbols, cryptic ceremonies, and eccentric customs that pushed the boundaries of medieval mysticism. These rituals, partly inspired by ancient myths and obscure religious practices, suggest the knights didn't just fight on battlefields. They dabbled in spiritual experiments that blended the sacred and profane in ways that defy conventional understanding. And, spoiler alert, the strange customs uncovered will make even their violent initiations and sordid scandals seem almost routine by comparison. So, as we brace ourselves for the next revelation, prepare to delve into the cryptic world of the Templars' mystical symbols and bizarre customs, where secrecy wasn't just about hiding sins, but about invoking powers that went beyond earthly control. The bizarre ceremonies we're about to uncover will make assassination plots look like children's games, and you thought tonight's dark tales had peaked. The violence and intrigue we unraveled in the previous segment, the whispered liaisons veiled in the shadowed halls of the Templar Order, merely set the stage for something far more unsettling. If the brutal initiations and cruel punishments make today's political scandals look like neighborhood squabbles, then the bizarre symbols and arcane customs we're about to dive into propel us into a world where madness and mystery intertwine. The Knights Templar were not just warriors or bankers. They were initiates in rituals dripping with enigmatic symbols, symbols that encoded secrets darker than the blackest night. But before we step through their veils of secrecy, let's remind ourselves, these weren't just cool medieval traditions. These rites were heavy with meaning and menace, designed not only to bind members to the Order, but to instill a carefully orchestrated fear and awe. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of secret handshakes, except these handshakes included cutting corners with reality, fiddling with forbidden knowledge, and dabbling in the occult. What could possibly go wrong? Welcome to the bewildering world of Templar symbolism, a language of signs and rituals as obscure as the secret codes of espionage agents, yet drenched in a mystical brew of Christian zealotry, pagan mysticism, and alchemical pretensions. The Templars didn't just carve crosses into their armor, they etched mysteries into their very souls. Take, for instance, the infamous Tau cross, a T-shaped symbol often worn by the Templars. While today it might look like a mere quirky emblem, back in the 12th and 13th centuries it was far more loaded. According to medieval chronicler and later historian Bernard of Clairvaux, this symbol was believed to provide divine protection against evil spirits and plague, a medieval magical talisman, if you will, pivotal during those centuries rife with fear of the unknown. But the Tau cross was just the tip of a vast iceberg. The Templars' seals, banners, and regalia drip with symbolism, from two knights sharing a single horse symbolizing fraternity and humility, to cryptic letters and strange geometrical patterns invoking hidden knowledge. Pliny the Elder might have chuckled at how natural symbolism evolved, but the knights took these signs and ritualized them into their core identity. And then there were the bizarre customs, practices that would make even the most ardent medieval ascetic blink twice. One of the more surreal rituals recorded involved the secret denial of Christ, where novice brothers were allegedly compelled to spit or trample upon sacred images during initiation. Suetonius might have bristled at this sacrilege and Tacitus would have scoffed, but the Templars apparently believed these acts of blasphemy were a way to prove absolute obedience and to sever worldly attachments. Imagine the mental gymnastics required. renouncing Christ in secret to finally profess undying loyalty. The ritual was cloaked in silence and fear, so any breach risked excommunication, or worse. But wait, there's more disturbing evidence. Juvenal, the acerbic Roman satirist who once mocked the elite's penchant for excess, would have savored the descriptions of the Templars' nocturnal ceremonies. These gatherings, often held in subterranean chapels beneath grand churches, were lit only by flickering candles and perfumed by incense said to open doors to the spiritual realm. Some accounts point to the use of cryptic chants in dead languages, Latin mixed with perhaps remnants of Coptic and Arabic, suggesting an exotic occult cocktail underpinning their theology. These ceremonies frequently involved arcane gestures, the shaking of cloaks to disperse evil spirits, the tracing of specific sigils on walls, and the invocation of angelic names that have never been fully deciphered. Even the Pope's inquisitors later noted that these rites appeared more akin to a magical cult than a pious Christian brotherhood. Chronicles from the Inquisition in the early 14th century, particularly the proceedings in Paris from 1307 onward, expose the stark reality behind Templar rituals. These documents, painstakingly compiled under orders of King Philip IV, describe confessions extracted under torture that mention the uncovering of nakedness, the kiss of shame, and other rites involving not just symbolic acts but deeply bizarre behaviors designed to enforce submission and secrecy. While some question the reliability of such confessions, the sheer number of consistent references suggests a web of ritualistic practices layered beneath the Templar public facade. The labyrinthine array of symbols used in Templar ceremonies was not merely for show. They encoded laws, oaths, and the order's internal hierarchies in a language that could be read only by the initiated. Inscriptions on their chapel altars at sites like Paris's Temple Church offer strange geometric carvings, triangles, inside circles intersecting with pentagrams, that scholars like Bernard de Iusitiu, Montfaucon in the 17th century labeled heretical and diabolical. More intriguingly, some have proposed that these patterns correspond with sacred geometry, believed by the Templars to be a cosmic map to divine secrets. This obsession with mysticism betrays the paradox of their so-called holy mission. While outwardly Christian warriors, they privately flirted with arcane knowledge and esoteric wisdom. Consider also the enigmatic beasts of the apocalypse, motif, murals, and engravings discovered in Templar sites featuring grotesque hybrid creatures. This imagery is not just a simple medieval fascination with monsters, but carefully chosen symbols representing their spiritual foes and internal fears. The monstrous figures, part dragon, part serpent, part malformed human, served as reminders of the ever-present battle between light and darkness, salvation and eternal damnation. When one indulges in such iconography, it's clear these knights were trading heavy on apocalyptic anxiety, painting themselves as the last bulwark against chaos. Psychologically, this end-of-days fixation might have justified extreme actions, including ritual tortures or secret killings. And as if this cocktail of arcane signs and apocalyptic horror wasn't disturbing enough, consider their use of relics, objects with alleged miraculous powers handled in bizarre ways. One documented example from the 12th century involved a relic said to be the belt of the Virgin Mary, which the Templars reportedly paraded during secret ceremonies designed to invoke divine favor. Eyewitnesses described the relic being dipped repeatedly into consecrated water, then sprinkled over acolytes to wash away sin and devilry. The line between religious practice and dark ritual blurred dangerously in such acts, suggesting a syncretism of Christian piety and pagan ritual magic. What emerges from this evidence is a pattern of systematic madness, a choreography of symbols and customs that cemented absolute loyalty but also bound the knights to a worldview heavily steeped in fear, power, and arcane mystery. It's a secret world that makes the sanitized images of chivalric heroes pale in comparison. But this is only part of the story. Among the most sinister practices hinted at in the records were rites that went beyond mere symbolism into outright occultism, bordering on what contemporaries would have labeled black magic. One tantalizing fragment from the chronicle of the monk Guibert of Nogent, written around 1115, alludes to Templar members engaging in shadow rites where invocations were made to unseen powers in the dead of night. Guibert's descriptions are vague, perhaps deliberately so, but they suggest that the Templars flirted with forbidden sorcery as part of their esoteric curriculum. Such practices, if widespread, would explain the later ferocity with which the Church sought to stamp out the order, not only for political reasons but for spiritual corruption. Sometimes these occult rituals reportedly included human elements. Whether symbolic or literal remains a haunting question. Some accusations during the trials spoke of blood sacrifices, though this likely intersects with propaganda. Still, the vivid testimonies of former knights tell of ceremonies involving cryptic chanting over mysterious containers, allegedly holding relics or perhaps darker trophies. Whether fact or fabrication, these accounts fuel an image of a brotherhood, balancing on the razor's edge between sanctity and sacrilege. The sexual transgressions we uncovered in the last segment gain new resonance here. Certain rites involved what modern historians call ritualized debasement, where personal purity was sacrificed in secret ceremonies to achieve spiritual initiation. This blurring of sacred and profane conjures uncomfortable parallels with cultic initiation rites throughout history, where losing one's identity through symbolic death and rebirth is central. In this sense, the Templars' bizarre customs were not random or cruel. They were calculated methods of psychological control and reinforcement of a secret elite. To understand the depth of these rituals, we must also observe their cultural context. Medieval Christendom was obsessed with symbolic acts, pilgrimages, penance, fasting, but the Templars pushed these behaviors into secret, often extreme territories. Their rituals combined Christian motifs with relic worship, pagan rites, and possibly influences from the Near East, where Crusaders had contact with Islamic esotericism. This syncretism made them appear heretical and dangerous, offering a terrifying glimpse into how tightly ritual and power were interwoven. Think about it. These soldiers were also custodians of vast wealth, bankers, and advisors to kings. Yet, behind the scenes, they were wrapped in secret knowledge and mysterious practices that deeply unsettled even their most fervent supporters. The rituals encoded their power structure, instilled obedience, kept dark secrets, and perhaps fed the paranoias that would ultimately bring their downfall. And if you thought those rituals were the height of Templar madness, just wait until we open the vaults on their shadowy alchemical pursuits, where science, superstition, and the ambition for forbidden knowledge collided in a deadly cocktail. The world of the Knights Templar was not just about sword and spirit, but also about chasing mystical formulas and secret potions that promise to unlock the very fabric of life and death. Prepare yourself, because what comes next reshapes everything you thought you knew about this legendary order. And so, having already dipped our toes, or perhaps plunged headfirst, into the twisted waters of Templar rituals and their arcane symbols, it's time to follow that rabbit hole right down into the murky, enigmatic realm of alchemy and pseudo-science. Because what's a shadowy secret society without a dash of clandestine chemistry and borderline mystical science to justify all their eccentric ceremonies? After the bizarre rites and lofty symbolism, the Templars' alchemical pursuits reveal an even darker obsession, the insatiable hunger for forbidden knowledge, the kind that today would make any modern wellness guru or conspiracy theorist blush with envy. The Templar Order wasn't just about medieval combat or banking services disguised behind cross-emblazoned cloaks. By the 12th and 13th centuries, especially during their peak in the early 1300s, they were dabbling in what they insisted was a legitimate science. But, spoiler alert, it wasn't science in any way resembling the systematic empirical approach we brag about in today's laboratories. Rather, it was an intoxicating mix of alchemy, astrology, and arcane philosophy, all wrapped in a fog of secrecy and cryptic texts that made the Voynich manuscript look like a children's book. To understand this, you have to remember that medieval Europe was a bizarre stew of faith, superstition, and the feeblest glimmers of rational thought. The Church officially scoffed at such pursuits, yet paradoxically tolerated the Templars' dark experiments, probably because they assumed the Knights' serious association with the Holy Land gave their babblings an air of divine legitimacy. What could possibly go wrong? The Knights, those holy warriors, were actively seeking the Philosopher's Stone, the mythical substance that, according to obscure Hellenistic lore, could transform base metals into gold and grant eternal life. To modern ears, that sounds about as promising as investing your life savings in an influencer promising life-changing keto teas. The earliest known Templar references linked to alchemical ambition appear in the latter half of the 13th century. In France, particularly Paris and Toulouse, where some cabals of knights reputedly consorted with scholars and mystics eager to delve into chemical transmutations and secret knowledge. The order's archives, though mostly destroyed or sealed tighter than Caesar's tomb, reportedly contained treatises on herbs, minerals, and processes meant to unlock nature's deepest secrets, half science, half witchcraft. Curiously, some chronicles mention the existence of the Book of the Secret of Secrets, a text attributed to King Solomon himself, detailing recipes and rituals for alchemical concoctions. This book allegedly found its way into the hands of the Templars, who viewed it as a divine blueprint that could aid their mission and perhaps secure their immortality. The intoxicating mix of sacred and profane culminated in experiments supposedly aimed at both spiritual and material transformation. Thankfully, none of these experiments ended with promising breakthroughs, aside from the transformation of reputations from holy knights to crackpot mystics. One particularly infamous figure who symbolizes the Templars' union with pseudoscience is Raymond Lull, a Catalan philosopher and mad scientist of his day. By the late 13th century, Lull was collaborating closely with members of the order, proposing complex systems of theological alchemy that bordered on the absurd and the blasphemous. His relentless attempts to decode divine mysteries with elaborate diagrams and arcane codes still inspire conspiracy theorists and crackpot alchemists today. But wait, there's more disturbing evidence the Knights dabbled far beyond mere gold-making fantasies. We have documented accounts from chroniclers like Guillaume de Nengy and the fiery sermons of the Dominican inquisitors who kept a close eye on Templar activities. They describe secret workshops where knights mixed potions and powders, performed strange distillations, and applied astrology to medical remedies, all under the cloak of secrecy. The alchemical chamber was said to be concealed beneath their fortresses, a subterranean lab where their clever blend of mysticism and chemistry unfolded in shadowy secrecies. No coincidence that these pseudo-scientific endeavors peaked just as the Templar order approached its dramatic downfall. Between 1307 and 1312, King Philip IV of France, known less affectionately as Philip the Fair, probably by very few people, tormented the Templars with charges ranging from heresy to devil worship. But a key accusation was their engagement in forbidden arts, including alchemy. The king's not-so-subtle message. These knights were practicing occult magic, dabbling in the very sciences the Church condemned. Basically, hey, you're not just annoying my bankers. You're breeding a secret cult with questionable chemistry sets. The infamous Paris trials unearthed testimonies, often coerced, obviously mentioning strange potions, rituals aimed at obtaining supernatural powers, and even attempts at creating elixirs akin to today's dubious anti-aging serums. Templar confessions, or so-called confessions, describe mixing fire waters and holy salts in hidden crucibles, hoping to capture divine essence. Modern historians suspect these accounts are partly fiction, but there's no smoke without fire. The Templars clearly flirted with knowledge bordering on alchemy and mystical science. What makes this historical Oddity, even more fascinating and unsettling, is how these medieval pseudosciences echo our own era's absurd obsessions. Much like today's viral wellness industries, replete with snake oils, detox teas, and legendary miracle cures, the Templars' alchemical ventures blur the line between earnest curiosity and intellectual corruption. The misuse of mysticism to lend credibility to otherwise laughable science isn't new. It just dresses differently in each century. The psychological underpinnings here are rich fodder for analysis. You see, the Templars were elite warriors and bankers with a polite air of discipline, but underneath they shared a common human craving: control over the unknown. Whether it was through secret rituals or the elusive promise of turning lead into gold, their pseudo-scientific pursuits reveal a desperate intellect grasping at straws in a dark void. This corrupted nobility, convinced of their unique destiny, transformed half-truths and outright fantasies into a faux science that stood between religious dogma and embryonic. Empiricism, the ancient sources give us tantalizing glimpses into this morally ambiguous blend of knowledge and deception. Pliny the Elder's vast encyclopedic works were still standard reference points in medieval study, yet interpretations of his natural history often veered into fantastical realms. The Templars, like many contemporaneous scholars, struggled with the volatile mix of natural philosophy and superstition. Meanwhile, Galen's medical texts were revered but frequently misunderstood, giving space for unproven remedies and concoctions concocted in secret laboratories. One particular manuscript, uncovered only in recent centuries and believed to be connected with the order, describes not only chemical processes but also the spiritual alchemy needed to ascend toward divine understanding. Talk about mixing religion and pseudoscience in an unholy marriage. The text advocates for transformative rituals that ingeniously mirrored their bizarre ceremonies of initiation and penance. And lest you think this was simply an isolated quirk of the Templar intellect, remember the wider medieval fascination with oracles and diviners. Templar knights frequently consulted astrologers before battles, relying on star charts to predict outcomes as if war tactics were best decided by cosmic dice rolls. Astrology, which today is mostly relegated to colorful horoscopes in popular magazines, held solemn sway, and the Templars were no exception. The well-known figure of Michael Scott, a 13th-century astrologer and alchemist, even provided consultations to powerful Templar leaders, blending celestial prophecy with their secret knowledge. The dark scientific veneer the Templars put on their hidden knowledge made them formidable, but it also made them subjects of fear and suspicion. Science without evidence and spirituality without faith become combustive, and the Templars, caught in that volatile mix, had no shortage of enemies eager to exploit any scandal. Ultimately, their pseudo-scientific ambitions were not just an intellectual curiosity, but a liability that contributed to their ruin. So, as we near the end of our exploration, consider this. In the halls where knights swore eternal loyalty and in chambers lit by candlelight, mysterious experiments danced on the border of science and sorcery. The Templars' secret alchemical chambers, their celestial consultations, and their clandestine texts reveal a group obsessed not just with earthly power, but with bending the laws of nature and spirituality alike. They were early torchbearers of a dangerous tradition, one where ignorance masqueraded as wisdom, and mystical delusion co-opted the language of science. In fact, isn't it eerily familiar? Just swap out the powdered lead and crucibles for essential oils and crystal pendants, and you've got the 21st century wellness carnival, with its promises of transformation and glimpses into the hidden truths that supposedly the mainstream refuses to consider. The medium changes, but the message, a seductive invitation to believe in magic dressed up as rationality. And so, with the Templars' alchemical dreams glowing faintly in the shadows, we are left with a complicated legacy. From sacred knights to proto-scientists gone wild. From holy orders dabbling in forbidden lore to unwitting architects of their own downfall. Their story is a cautionary tale of how power and knowledge, when combined with greed and superstition, can spawn not heroes but cautionary legends. Up next, we will pull all these threads together, examining how the forbidden rituals, bizarre customs, secret symbols, and pseudo-scientific endeavors combine to shape a narrative that still captivates and disturbs us today. What does the Knights Templar saga ultimately tell us about power, secrecy, and the dark dance between knowledge and delusion? Stick around for the final chapter as we unravel the truth behind the legend, uncovering what really happened when faith met forbidden science. Because after all this, the Templars' story is more than medieval history. It's a mirror reflecting our own ongoing fascination with forbidden knowledge and the costs we pay for chasing it. So, there you have it. Your absolutely thrilling journey through boring old history. We've explored 4 pillars of Knights Templar corruption that, when combined, created a blueprint for how secretive orders can sow their own decay from within. The brutal, mind-breaking initiation rites, the whispered and euphemistic hidden liaison, the cryptic, arcane symbolism and bizarre customs, and finally, the intoxicating but ultimately disastrous pseudoscientific alchemical pursuits. But these weren't separate phenomena. It's clear these elements wove together into an insidious system, each feeding the other to create a tangled web of power, secrecy, and self-destruction. Take, for instance, the brutal initiations highlighted. In our first act, ordeals designed not just to test courage but to obliterate individual will, from kneeling on sharp stones to ritually spitting on the cross. These torturous trials instilled an obedience so absolute that the order could demand denial of sacred Christian tenets without losing its grip. Think of it as psychological furniture rearrangement, shoving faith into the closet while making loyalty to the order the shining altar. This intense physical and mental breakdown laid the groundwork for the toxic brotherhood described in our second segment's whispered liaisons, where vows of chastity were systematically violated, yet any hint of deviation was met with savage punishment. The sharp sticks of initiation turned into darker sticks wielded inside cloistered commanderies, where secrets were currency and torture. Public whippings, solitary confinement in damp dungeons, were tools of control. The same order that demanded absolute secrecy built a culture where exploitation and betrayal thrived in whispered shadows, masked by euphemism and ritual. And these personal dynamics were reflected in the third act's bizarre rituals and symbolism. Arcane signs like the Tau cross, cryptic geometric carvings, and apocalyptic beasts, all marinated in a cocktail of Christian zealotry and pagan mysticism. These weren't mere decorations, but coded messages designed to deepen loyalty while fostering an obsessive, apocalyptic worldview. The secret ceremonies, chanting in dead languages, gestures invoking unseen powers, were scripts for a drama of fear and awe, a psychological boot camp of mysticism locking knights into roles both warrior and cultist simultaneously. This symbolic fog mirrored the very initiation paradox, denying Christ to prove piety, embracing dark rites while claiming holy mission. It was a theater of contradictions, priming members both mentally and spiritually for the alchemical acts disclosed in our final segment. The alchemy, the medieval equivalent of today's wellness influencers peddling miracle cures. The same knights who marched into battle wielding swords also tangled themselves in pseudosciences, mixing astrology, mystical chemistry, and forbidden knowledge. Their quest for the philosopher's stone, divine elixirs, and spiritual transformation was a desperate grasp at control over fate and mortality, akin to investing trust in a snake oil salesman promising eternal youth. Here, the elixir wasn't just a potion, but a metaphor for transcending human limitations. But as with all illusions, it came with a steep price. These alchemical obsessions merged organically with their secret rituals and symbols, forming a closed loop of escalating delusion and control. Knowledge, power, secrecy, twisted together into a toxic brew that fed paranoia and justified violence. What psychological pattern do we see? A classic spiral of control obsessed with secrecy and loyalty, where ritualized violence breaks down the individual, clandestine behaviors destabilize trust, symbolism creates ideological prisons, and pseudoscience fuels a messianic belief in the Order's unique destiny. This is no medieval anomaly. These four elements, brutal initiations, hidden scandals, mystic symbols, and false science, are the four horsemen of corruption, galloping through any secretive institution craving absolute control. They feed each other, each becoming a tool to silence dissent, enforce conformity, and cloak abuses. The Knights Templar were master class in the dark arts of power gone wrong. Of course, all of this wasn't merely dusty medieval scandal fodder. These themes echo loudly in our modern world. The brutal initiation rituals, with their violence, cloaked in tradition, echo today's political scandals where hazing and coercion become tools of gatekeeping and obedience. Think of elite political or corporate clubs where power is earned through public humiliation, loyalty tests, or sanctioned abuse. The paradox of sworn loyalty trumping personal ethics? Still alive and well in many power structures today. The hidden liaisons and secret coercion inside the brotherhood? That's the blueprint for contemporary authoritarian regimes. Ruthless, hierarchical organizations and cult-like factions where personal exploitation is systemic and enforced with silence masks and physical punishment. The euphemisms of medieval chroniclers read like the political spin cycles of today's scandals, where truth is buried under layers of coded language, plausible deniability, and orchestrated fear. The way the Templars' leadership weaponized secrecy and punishment to maintain control resonates alarmingly with modern abuses anywhere authority hides behind closed doors. And the Templars' obsession with arcane symbols and bizarre customs? It's a spiritual ancestor to today's cult-like groups obsessed with secret knowledge, ritualized identities, and symbolic exclusivity. Modern fringe movements use logos, handshakes, and coded language to build a mystique that engenders loyalty and suppresses questioning. The dark mysticism of the Templars finds its echoes in the symbols adorning everything from corporate branding to extremist groups promising salvation through obscure rites. Finally, their pseudoscientific alchemies, the magical thinking masquerading as rationality, are perfectly mirrored in today's wellness industry. Full of detox teas, crystal healing, and anti-aging elixirs marketed with mystical flair but little empirical basis. The Templar blend of superstition and half-baked science parallels how modern society perpetually chases quick fixes and secret formulas for power, youth, or enlightenment. It's the same game. Promise transformation through hidden knowledge, cloak it in authority, and sell it as truth. Only the packaging changes. So how does power still corrupt through the same mechanisms? It manipulates human craving for belonging and meaning, weaponizes secrecy and ritual to break down autonomy, and cloaks self-interest in grand narratives, whether Crusader holy war or cosmic wellness revolution. The Knights Templars' blueprint is alive and well. Behind every curtain of secrecy, behind every cult of personality, those dark patterns echo through the ages. It's as if human nature is wired to repeat these tragic cycles: pain, betrayal, control, all masquerading as order and hope. Historically, the Templars' inner corruption had seismic consequences. Their brutal initiations, secret liaisons, cryptic rituals, and alchemical ambitions eroded the Order's integrity and made them vulnerable to enemies, both political and religious. King Philip IV's ruthless crackdown in 1307 was as much about seizing wealth and power as it was about exploiting public fears stoked by these scandals, showcasing how internal rot invites external destruction. This downfall echoes in every institution whose unseen rot festers beneath a polished surface, warning that unchecked secrecy and the abuse of power spell doom. Yet the Templars' legacy survives not just in ruined chapels or forgotten dungeons, but in our collective imagination. the archetypal secret society, the shadowy knight, the forbidden knowledge. Their cautionary tale reminds us how exalted ideals, once corrupted by fear and ambition, become the architects of their own destruction. Perhaps the most perverse lesson of all is this: the Knights Templar didn't fall because external armies were stronger or because faith faltered. They collapsed because absolute power transformed every institution. Initiation rites, brotherly bonds, sacred symbolism, and knowledge quests into stages for the same performance, a systematic conversion of vice into virtue through the dark alchemy of power and propaganda. Their sacred mission warped into a labyrinth of paranoia, violence, mysticism, and ultimately, betrayal. And if you think this is just ancient history, well, look around. The costumes have changed, but the play remains the same. Sweet dreams, and remember, this is just the stuff that made it into the official records.